I have swept this hall every morning for 30 years. I do not say that to make it sound like a long time. It was a long time. You lose count of individual mornings at some point. They become a single motion, a single quality of light coming down through the ceiling grate, a single smell of old stone and undisturbed paper. 30 years is not a prison sentence. It is simply what the work looked like when you added it up. The Hall of Unread Texts sits 3 levels below the main reading chambers of the Vault of Enduring Texts. The scholars up there know it exists, the way you know there is a basement beneath a house you live in, abstractly, without ever quite going there. They come down occasionally. A delegation from the Meridian Institute came 4 years ago and spent 2 hours photographing the walls before deciding the inscriptions were cataloging errors and going back upstairs. Before them, a team from the Outer Survey Commission spent a week trying to unlock the central Codex and went home with headaches and no data. I remember offering them tea on the 3rd day. They did not acknowledge the offer. The Codex has been there longer than the scholars have had words for time. The pedestal it rests on is carved from a single piece of pale stone, the grain running up through it like a record of something geological and patient. And the Codex itself sits in a shallow depression worn into the top of that stone, not placed there recently, but arrived at over centuries the way a river arrives at a particular bend. The seal along its spine has never opened, not for anyone, not in 3,000 years of recorded institutional attempts, and the record-keeping before that gets unreliable, so the true number may be larger. I have dusted around it for 30 years. Around. Specifically. The first supervisor I worked under told me not to touch it directly. The second one did not mention it, but I had already formed the habit by then. I would sweep the floor of the hall, reshelve any tablets that had worked their way loose from their brackets, check the humidity seals on the 6 alcoves that held the oldest cases, and orbit the central pedestal without making contact. It felt appropriate, not reverential, exactly. I did not think of it in those terms. It simply felt like proper custody. The Codex was not mine to handle. I was the person who kept everything around it in order so that the person it was waiting for could find it well when they came. The morning everything changed started with a sound I had never heard before. A low crack from somewhere in the upper arch of the hall's ceiling, followed by a fall of fine grit and old mortar dust that came down in a soft curtain and landed across the hall, the shelving, the floor, and the Codex. I stood and watched it settle. Then I did what I always did. I swept the floor first, habit, sequence, the order of things, then the shelving. Then I lifted my cloth and moved to the pedestal and swept the dust from the Codex's surface, the way I had swept dust from every other surface in that hall for 3 decades without thinking about it. I ran the cloth from the top of the cover to the base of the spine in one even stroke. The sound the Codex made was not loud. It was the sound of something sealed for a very long time releasing, which is less dramatic than it sounds and more fundamental. A deep, structural exhale, like a pressure equalizing. The seal along the spine separated, not all at once, from the base upward, in increments, the way ice cracks in the spring. I stepped back. I did not drop the cloth. The light that came through the Codex's cover was the color of old gold, not bright, not theatrical, but warm in the way that stone gets warm after a full day of sun has worked through it. It came up through the inscription channels carved into the cover and lit them from below, and I could read, for the first time, what those channels said. I had memorized their shapes years ago, the way you memorize the grain of a floor you have crossed 10,000 times, without ever knowing what the shapes meant. Now lit from within, they resolved into words. I heard the scholars before I saw them, footsteps on the stairs, several sets, moving quickly. Word travels fast in the upper halls when a resonance reading spikes. I did not call anyone. I did not know a resonance reading had spiked. I had simply swept the dust off a surface that had accumulated grit, because that was my job, and because leaving grit on an artifact seemed wrong. They came in fast and stopped, 7 of them. 3 from the current meridian rotation, 2 from the Survey Commission's resident team, and 2 I did not recognize in the institutional gray of an accreditation body I could not name. They stopped at the hall entrance and looked at the Codex, and then at me, and then at the Codex again. One of them, a senior archivist named Proust, who had been kind to me over the years, in the distracted way that busy people are kind to people they do not quite see, said, "What did you do?" I said I had swept the dust off it. He looked at me for a moment, as though this were in a language he did not speak. The Codex continued to open. That is the only word for it. Not dramatically, not with any urgency, but with the slow, deliberate movement of something that has been waiting long enough that it feels no need to rush, now that the waiting is over. The cover separated from the body and turned back. The pages inside were not pages in any sense I had a word for. They were layers of something translucent, and each layer was inscribed in a hand so fine and so regular that I could not look directly at it without my eyes wanting to slide away. The light intensified, not painfully, just fully, the way a room fills when someone opens a curtain you had forgotten was drawn. And then the Codex spoke. I have tried to describe the sound of it to people since, and I cannot get it right. It was not a voice in the way that a human voice is a voice. It did not come from a mouth. It did not carry breath. It did not rise and fall with the rhythm of a body. It came from the stone and the light and the air in the room simultaneously, the way a bell's note comes, not just from the struck metal, but from everything around it. It said, "Keeper of the Unbroken Record." Not a question, not a greeting, a designation. The way a ledger names a thing, not to introduce it to itself, but to record, for the archive, what it already is. The room went very quiet. Proust had his hand on the wall behind him. The 2 gray-coated accreditors had not moved. I was still holding the cloth. The Codex continued. Brevity, I understood later, is the native register of things that have waited 3,000 years to say something. They have had time to reduce it to what matters. What it said was this. The vault of enduring texts had not been built as a library. It had been built as a trust. The texts it held were not for reading. They were for safekeeping, against the eventual need of whoever came after. The keeper's role had never been administrative. It had been sovereign, and the trust had included a mechanism. It would not open to anyone who came seeking it, because anyone who came seeking it had a use for it, and use corrupts. It would open only for the one who had spent themselves keeping it, without knowing what it held. The proof of qualification was the record of custody, every act of preservation, every fragment retrieved, every seal checked and case relatched, logged in the vault's own memory across however many years it required. 30 years in my case. I set the cloth down on the edge of the pedestal. Proust said something behind me. I did not catch the words and did not turn. The light in the inscription channels had shifted from warm gold to something quieter, the color of afternoon through old glass. One of the gray-coated accreditors asked, in a voice working hard to sound official, "Are you aware of the institutional implications of this recognition event?" I told her I was not. I told her I was the morning hall custodian, and I had come in to sweep, and a piece of the ceiling had cracked. She wrote something down. What I did not tell her, what I am telling now, the only way I know to make sense of it, is what I felt standing in that light with 7 scholars behind me, and a vault that had been waiting longer than any civilization currently operating had existed. I did not feel chosen in the way that word usually implies, as if something had reached in and selected me from a pool. What I felt was more like recognition in its original sense, a re-knowing of what had already been true. I had been the keeper of the unbroken record since the first morning I walked into that hall and decided, without being asked, to keep things whole. The Codex had simply been waiting for me to find out. The record does not belong to those who study it. It belongs to the one who refused to let it break.